I felt somehow uncomfortable and uneasy. I thought, isn't here an underlying assumption in this title itself, an assumption that I'm invisible, and hence I have to speak differently for the others, for the world, whatever that world is, to notice me. Isn't that imperialistic itself to assign me a place, a role, to see me, my existence, from the position of knowing how I should feel and how I should see myself as an Armenian? Like I'm the context, and this is the knowledge I am allowed to produce. Then my second thought was, okay, Lusine, come on. Why do you assume that this is why you have received this offer? Maybe they thought that your professional background, your experience and knowledge, your writings are the reason why you should be the one to discuss this topic. So I first self-orientalized, self-colonized myself, and only after that began to look at it differently, to position myself differently, to see myself differently. And this made me think that the mere possibility of my first reaction was already something that signaled an existing issue. The elephant in the room and the importance of continuously, repetitively speaking about it. The importance of finding a language which will allow not only you to see me, but which will also make it possible for me to see myself differently. Emancipating, decolonizing myself from the post-coloniality of my existing context. The importance of emancipating not only the language I speak, and by language, of course, I do not mean the language per se, but also my thinking about the language I speak, my perception of my context, and the way I speak about it. I'm a person who does not believe in the history. I'm a person who believes in histories, or at least the possibility of histories. To me, the best way to overshadow an empire or to get out of its shadow is to overshadow its single-voice narrative told confidently from the position of truth, from the position of power, to overshadow it through polyvocality of voices, languages, positions, narratives, through shifting the center, through acknowledging the existence of multiple centers, through not only simply acknowledging that Africa as a continent is much bigger, but redrawing the map from the position of Africa. It requires a lot of effort, determination, everyday work. So today I will bring in several narratives, as I believe in multiple narratives. I will give voice to multiple histories. They seem trivial, but they are the ones I feel like sharing at the moment with you. My first story is from a novel I am currently working on. The novel describes developments it starts in early 2000s, where there is this female character who constantly goes to church to pray. The woman prays for her family and loved ones. She prays for her mother, for her sisters and brothers, for her friends, and for her father, for her husband, and for her children. As time passes, she prays for her husband fighting in the Second Artsakh-Karabakh War, then for her son fighting in the Third Artsakh-Karabakh War. At the end, she prays for peace in her homeland, the region, and the world, every time. She asks God to give wisdom to the leaders of her country, the neighboring countries, and the world, so they don't go to war again. So she starts praying for Kocharyan, Aliyev, and Erdogan, Bush, and Putin. Then she prays for Serge Sargsyan, Aliyev, and Erdogan, Obama, and Putin. Then she prays for Pashinyan, Aliyev, and Erdogan, Trump, and Putin. The never-changing constants are the remnants of the empires, the authoritarian, self-reproducing regimes which hinder peaceful coexistence. So what should the woman do for the God to hear her? Maybe she should stop praying for the existing paternalistic order. Maybe she should stop thinking that it's them who should act wisely for her world to simply exist. Maybe she should increase her own agency. She should start to believe in her agency. She should act. And maybe the first act is to stop praying for all these leaders, to stop believing that they have the power and take her destiny in her own hands. one self-aware, self-conscious, responsible act of getting out of the shadow of existing patriarchal order, speaking it up and speaking in her own language. The language she might have even forgotten that existed, as she had been using the commonly known and understandable one to pray to God, might contribute more to the change than praying for the existing order to solve her problems. Maybe her freedom and her sense of dignity will not only emancipate herself, but will set a bar for those who still live under the shadow of an empire. And Ukraine has set that bar high. It has changed the narrative about itself. My second story was born yesterday. Yesterday, we were taken to see Superhumans, a rehabilitation center for prosthetics, reconstructive surgery, and rehabilitation for war victims. And right there, I realized that Ukraine is already out of the shadow of the empire, as it already speaks a different language. That empire many of us were once part of at some point would simply deny the existence of disabled war veterans, as they were spoiling the picture of the victory. Starting from 1948 in the USSR, people that have lost their limbs during the war were collected and put in so-called invalid homes, far away from major cities, so as the victorious Soviet people would not see them and would easily glorify the great victory. The most famous one was on Valam Island on the Ladoga Lake. This is how that empire solved the issue. So treating people differently, ensuring dignified life for them is a different language. It is not the language of the empire we knew. Well, I assume everybody expects me to speak about the genocide, right? That is the master narrative about Armenians that one would expect to hear. I will not disappoint you. You can stick to your stereotypes as far as the issue is not solved. So my third story is rooted in the Armenian history and is one of the defining narratives for Armenians and remains so until now. After the 1877-1878 Russian-Turkish War, there was the Congress of Berlin, which eventually reorganized the Balkans, leading to further breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. The minorities of Ottoman Empire had sent their delegations to the Congress. The head of the Armenian delegation was the future head of the Armenian Church, Hromadske TV, who at the time was the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople. After returning from the Congress, he described the Congress as a cauldron where harissa, a traditional dish, was being cooked. He said, I approached and presented the petition given to me by the National Assembly, and I begged that they fill my bowl with harissa too. Just then, the plenipotentiary standing at the head of the cauldron asked me, where is your iron ladle? Harissa is indeed being distributed here, but those without an iron ladle may not approach. If in the near future harissa is again distributed, do not come without a ladle, otherwise you will again return empty-handed. Well, dear Armenians, I could have surely stuck my ladle made of paper into the cauldron of harissa, but it would have become wet and stayed here in the cauldron. What business did requests and petitions have in a place where weapons are talked and where sabers shone? Thus, Balkan nations that were armed and fought for their freedom got it at the Berlin Congress, while Armenians who were there only with petition got nothing. One of the legacies of the Berlin Congress was the Armenian question, which basically referred to the protection of the freedoms of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and which actually explains the next 40 years of the Ottoman Armenians' history in the context of Ottoman, Russian, German, and British politics. It ended in 1915, when the young Turk government decided to solve the issue permanently through what is known as the Armenian genocide. You may say this is a 19th century language. Is it relevant today? So why do I bring this narrative in? Well, the imperial discourse we are dealing with until now represents nations and communities it wants to dominate and control as nationalist, separatist, and they actively use the language of anti-terrorist operation when describing a full-scale invasion. Russia uses this language uses this language in Ukraine. Another remnant of the USSR, Azerbaijan, used the same language when attacking Karabakh last year. Nationalists, Western agents, etc., these are the commonly used words to describe us and to justify the violence. So the 19th century narrative will remain relevant until this language is there. Does this imply the only way of getting out of the shadow of empire is to fight the empire and fight it loudly? Well, I don't know. But if the empire does not understand any other language, if papers and the existing legal order do not work, you seem to be forced to resort to the iron ladle. You have to protect your right to exist, your right to life. In these modern times we live in, sometimes the language of ladle, the language of not giving up, speaks louder than the language of thousands of letters. It makes you visible. It puts you on the map. The fourth and the last story, again, would meet the expectation I assume you have from me. It is the story of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians. Their story largely remained unnoticed up until last September, when after a 9-month-long blockade, followed by an Azerbaijani attack, and faced with a threat of ethnic cleansing, over 100,000 of Artsakh's native Armenians left their homes under the gaze of so-called Russian peacekeepers, who were there to guarantee peace and the existence of those Armenians. That was the language that Artsakh Armenians chose. That was the language that made them visible. That was their dignified choice. They chose the right to life and freedom over everything else. Since then, and up until probably last week, the Russian peacekeepers continued issuing statements every day. Российским миротворческим контингентом продолжается выполнение задач на территории Карабаха. Нарушение режима прекращения огня не зафиксировано. Russian peacekeeping contingent continues to carry out tasks in the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. No ceasefire violations were recorded. So the long shadow of the empire is shaking and shrinking. It is getting marginalized. Perhaps it will not be visible soon, as the language more and more people choose to speak in Ukraine, in Georgia, or in Armenia is a liberated, emancipated, as well as liberating, empowering language. Is a language that puts the person, puts human lives, human dignity in the center. Human being and not the system. It is the language of shifting center. Language which accepts that every life matters. Language of agency and not the agents. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. All right. So, first of all, I really want to thank everyone for having me here. And so, I really want to talk to you about what it's like being a Black American and my experience as a U.S. citizen, and talking about imperialism and tying that to Ukraine. And I just want to leave you with 3 things. I'll tell you about basically how I was able to put these stories together based on my upbringing in the United States, and tie that to the election that's happening right now, and how we can all tell our stories. And so the genesis of my work is really about how we can all learn how to care about one another, and how we can be invested in each other's safety and security. So, New York is my home, but I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And Detroit, Michigan, for decades has been the largest Black city in the United States of America. And I just want to start off by saying that Detroit is one of those, is the largest Black city. It's a city that experienced redlining, basic political redlining, which means that when my parents and when my grandmother moved from the South, where most of the enslaved Black people were, my grandmother moved to Detroit in around the 1950s, and her arrival in Detroit was met by racist urban planning. Basically, there were certain places in the city where Black people were pushed into, and you all know them as ghettos, but those ghettos were designed for Black people to live in because of racial discrimination in housing. And I also have to acknowledge that America itself is a settler colonial state. America's success came from the genocide of indigenous peoples, and I think that we have to recognize that. And in addition to that genocide of indigenous peoples, it came with more than 250 plus years of enslavement of Black people. So it's really important to state that from the beginning. We are doing the right thing by supporting Ukraine now. But I think it's important to acknowledge our economic might came from hundreds of years of slave labor, which people in my community continue to suffer from to this very day. But I really want to discuss, starting off, how did I begin to tell the story of Ukraine by measuring my experience. So, like I said, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and so I grew up around Black people all my life, and then I attended the historically Black college. And then at that historically Black college in Little Rock, Arkansas, I started traveling abroad. I went to Haiti, first of all, a country that has its own experience with American colonialism and French Western colonialism. And I went to Senegal, which is another country in the global South that experienced anti-Blackness and America's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. And then after this experience, that's when my journey to Ukraine began. I started off in Russia, where I volunteered in a Russian orphanage. And yeah, I know I started off my journey to Ukraine in hell, so forgive me. But after I went to Russia in my senior year, I applied for Peace Corps. And I was accepted to the program, and they were going to send me to Russia before the program was canceled, which was a very fortunate decision, because that sent me off to the country of Georgia, Sarkadbelo, right? And so that's when I started to really understand Russian colonialism and how it applied and how I drew parallels to my life. So when I went to Georgia, from the American perspective, Georgians are white people, you know? and I was 23 years old, and I was the only Black person in my group. And what I noticed was that the Georgians felt a little bit more of a commonality with me, and I didn't quite understand why. And they were calling me brother this and bro that, and it was, you know, I was trying to figure it out. And they were saying, well, you know, Terrell, when we go to Russia, they call us Black. And I said, you're not. But you have to remember, I was 23 years old, and I didn't understand that race functioned very differently in this part of the world than it does in the United States. So part of my journey involved educating myself and informing myself about how different peoples around the world face oppression, and how the story may not be exactly like mine, but there share some similarities. So in my first journey to understanding Russian colonialism, I understood that a Georgian guy thought I was his brother, right? And so from that point, I really began to understand Russia's role in Georgia as far as being a colonial state. And then I was there, and I saw the Rose Revolution, those type of things. And after that, I went to graduate school, and I just became interested in Ukraine, because I said, oh, this was a country that was that was colonized by Russia, and so it was pretty big. I said, okay, I want to learn more about it. And so I wanted to learn more about the countries that were colonized by Russia, for the very simple fact that many of my peers wanted to become Russia experts. And I wanted to understand the people who were resonating with me and who said that we feel connected to you. And so I got pulled into this type of work when I really did not intend to. And I'll skip a few years. When I was in graduate school, I applied for a Fulbright scholarship, and then I was awarded a Fulbright to come to Ukraine to study for a year and a half. And there was one defining story that helped me to understand Ukraine's relationship with Russia. I was in the city of Lviv, and I was with a Fulbright group, so it was about 20 of us, or 30 of us. And this old Ukrainian man waded through our group and came directly to me. And he extended his hand. And he said, "Do you speak Russian or do you speak Ukrainian?" I'm sorry, guys, at the beginning, the government only paid for Russian. I'm taking Ukrainian this summer, but we spoke in Russian, and he said, "Do you want to know the history of our country?" Can you imagine? You're walking down the street, and some old man asks you, "Do you want to know the history of their country?" So I said, "Sure." And his first sentence to me was, "Ukraine is a colony of Russia, and Putin and Moscow wants to colonize us." And then he went on, and then one of my colleagues politely pulled me away. But the most important point that I want to share with you is that I became very aware that just my very presence here drew people to me in ways that I never anticipated. And so part of the journey of actually understanding each other in a polarized world, it required several things from me. I always believe that if we want to talk about decolonizing the world, that we need to start with decolonizing our own minds. It means that we have to start basically looking at our own stereotypes and our own misperceptions in order to understand others if we ourselves want to be understood. And it took me a while to really grasp that these people who in America would look white would find some form of solidarity with me. But it was a very personal education that I only would have gotten if I were living in these situations. And so I really want to talk to you about moving into the full-scale invasion and how all these experiences came to help me. Before the full-scale invasion began, I was here in Ukraine, and my goal was not to cover a war, because I had never covered one before. My goal was to start a tourism company taking people to the Carpathian Mountains. And interestingly enough, I spent my whole COVID summer near a town called Uzhhorod, by the way. But I spent half of my time on Black-centered media, African-American media. And they were asking me about the war. They were asking me about what do you think Putin's intentions were. And I was fully able to answer that. But they were really asking me, as a Black man, why was I in Ukraine? I mean, that was just the number one curious thing. And I told them that I felt comfortable here and that people felt a connection to me in ways that they did not have with my peers, and that the conversations that I would have with them were vastly different than the ones that many of my white American friends had. And what helped me at the beginning was when Putin would talk about Ukraine and the very derogatory and inhumane way that he spoke about you, about this country and about its people. It reminded me of the very derogatory and racist ways that governors in the 1960s and the 1970s talk about Black people. Very blatant, very direct. Not to say that we don't have that racism right now. I mean, Donald Trump is running for president, right? But, but I was able to draw these parallels, and a lot of the Black audiences that I communicate with, they got it. They understood it. And so what was also important was that I was one of the few people on television who could speak about Ukraine because I lived in Ukraine, as opposed to being a correspondent that was based in Moscow and coming down and moonlighting until all these media companies were eventually forced out of Moscow, and now they're in Kyiv. So the way that I was able to talk about Ukraine and the really genocidal language that Putin used towards Ukrainians, I connected that to the unjust ways and the racist language that white people often use against black people, and it drew a connection. And so I was actually pulled on television literally every single day to talk about these parallels, and that's what drew people and that's what helped them to understand. And so I think part of basically talking about colonialism and sharing our stories, it includes us to draw these parallels. And I was definitely happy to do it. So I really want to talk to you about the fact that how Ukraine ties into this election. So,
I have no time, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'll close it out. So the short version of this is that the unfortunate reality is that Ukraine and the MAGA generation, at first, Donald Trump and the MAGA coalition was using their racism to attack black people, the Latinx community, LGBTQ people. And because Ukraine doesn't fit under America first, then they started targeting it towards Ukraine. So literally for the past 6 months, white nationalism was used in order to uphold, not to uphold, but to threaten Ukraine's national sovereignty. And so the way that I tell the story of Ukraine in closing is one where I discuss our ties and what draws us together, and by telling each other stories. And so the more that we tell each other stories and communicate about our own struggles, the stronger and interconnected that we will be. So thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that we all take away the lesson of telling each other stories so that we can become united together as people.
Well, first of all, hello everyone, and thank you for the organizers for putting together such an incredible panel. It's a great honor to be on this stage following the presentations, brilliant presentations by my colleagues, telling their personal stories, stories of their countries in the context of fight against imperialism, and drawing parallels between the experiences of their countries and those of Ukraine. Well, I am a Ukrainian, and I don't have to explain you the context and the importance of the fight that Ukraine is currently waging against Russian aggression, and which is also the fight against Russian imperialism, against the history of oppression that Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russia, implemented against Ukraine. And I will talk today about one of the tools that Ukrainians have used in the past and are using extensively now to fend off that Russian imperialism, to get out of the shadow of the empire, as is the title of this panel, and to establish their agency, because ultimately humor is about establishing one's agency. And I don't think I will, make a lot of, I will tell a lot of new things to you today. I'm sure I'll show like some of the most memorable memes and jokes that were created since the start of Russian full-scale invasion, and also some that were created before by Ukrainian social media users. And you are familiar probably with most of them, but this is just a reminder, of how Ukrainians, we all use humor as a tool of resistance, as a tool of unity, and as a tool of the fight against Russian imperialism. So let's just start, this overview of how Ukrainians used humor. Of course, what Ukrainians used humor for showing defiance. And this very first example of defiance was the border guard at the Serpent Island, who told the Russian warship to F off in the very first days of the full-scale invasion. And that became a meme, that became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. That was something surprising for many in other countries. A lot of international media picked up this story because surprisingly, it turned out that Ukrainians are not ready, are not willing to give up. They're not going to surrender, they're going to fight. And this is something that the world didn't expect. So of course, you know, the famous border guard, the famous phrase that he said became one of the first symbols of this huge Ukrainian resistance against Russian imperialism in this war. Demonstrate and resolve, something, you know, similar to showing defiance. Ukrainians showed that Russia might be a much bigger country. It might be, you know, an enemy that is seemingly much more powerful, but it doesn't mean that it's going to win. Yes, it's a struggle maybe of David against Goliath, and Ukraine is not in a position that initially seemed like a winning one, but it doesn't mean that the fight is not worth fighting for, that, you know, that it doesn't mean that resistance is futile. So demonstrating this resolve against the Russian bear. Another example of how Ukrainians use humor. Questioning Russia's motivation. Of course, you all remember famous videos of Russian soldiers stealing washing machines and sending them back home, toilets and other household items that apparently they experience a shortage of inside Russia. So again, like ridiculing, questioning the intentions. What are Russians really fighting for in Ukraine? Are they fighting for Putin? Are they fighting to, you know, steal more of household items? Does it really all make sense? That was another example of, you know, Ukrainians, how they use humor to communicate, to ridicule Russians and their motivation in this war. This one is intertwined, you know, with the previous example, ridiculing Russia's intentions. So many people were expecting Ukraine to fall in the first 3 days, and so many were surprised when it didn't. And, you know, making a point that, well, actually, Ukraine can offer much more than you expect. Ukraine is a country that maybe you really know very little about. If you expected it to fall in 3 days, was something that, again, Ukrainians used humor to highlight, to kind of get this message across that, look, we are not as weak as you thought we might be, and we are worth supporting, and we can fight with Russia, and we can make fun of them to make them less scary. Mocking enemy successes, another example of how Ukrainians used humor. You know, this meme refers to Russian short-lasted occupation of Kherson, in parts of Kherson region. And it is based on a meme that circulated in the UK about the short permanency at the in the Prime Minister's office of Liz Truss, that lettuce outlasted her in her position. So this again was something that Ukrainians and their supporters used. They used the meme that was already familiar to audiences in the West to describe the situation in Ukraine, to describe Ukrainian resolve, and to, again, ridicule Russians and their successes and their claimed successes, which very often were short-lived. They were not as big as, you know, Russia tried to portray them. Ukrainians and Ukrainian supporters also used humor to expose Russian lies and propaganda. And here you see a cartoon dog from an organization called NAFO, North Atlantic Fellow Organization. Those of you who are social media users, who are Twitter users, are familiar with this. Ukraine supporters from all over the world, they put on the avatars of cartoon dogs in their social media profiles, and they use their social media to first fundraise for Ukraine, to donate to Ukrainian armed forces, but also to expose lies of Russian officials. They ridiculed Russian propaganda, of Russian state media. They ridiculed statements by Russian state officials. And they just drew the attention to all the absurdity of the narratives that Russia uses to justify this war, and kind of to highlight the importance of Ukraine's fight. So Ukrainians used humor, but also Ukrainians' allies used humor. questioning Russian historical narratives. And here we are coming to issue of fighting with Russian imperialism and how humor can be helpful with that. So this is an example of a tweet by Ukraine's official account, which is a case in itself. So it was launched back in 2017 by a group of activists who were thinking, how can Ukraine expose and resist huge Russian disinformation machine if it doesn't have the same resources as Russia does? So Ukrainians had to come up with a creative approach with something cheap, with something that would work really well. And that's how this Ukraine's official account on Twitter was born. That became popular very quickly, and now it has more than 3 million followers. And you see here what they did. They mocked and exposed, again, Russian disinformation shared on social media by Russian officials and by Russian official accounts. And like this, like in this example, the narrative, you know, that Ukraine was happy in the Soviet Union, and that, and that Crimea is Russian. So there are two Russian imperial narratives in just this one example that they shared on social media, and Ukrainians just tried to ridicule that by calling, look, this is a toxic ex who's trying to drag us into the past, who's using these imperialist narratives to kind of describe that there is some sort of nostalgia for the Soviet Union in Ukraine, and also to claim that Crimea is Russia when it is obviously is Ukraine. And another example, again of Ukraine's account and what they did, how they questioned Russian imperialist narratives and Russian view of Ukrainian history, highlighting the absurdity, of Russian imperialist ideology, is this exchange, again, even before the full-scale invasion, back in 2017, when Russians posted this tweet during the visit of their dictator Putin to France, in which he said that Princess Anna of Kiev Rus was a Russian princess. And again, used this opportunity to claim that Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus just share common history, and they are brotherly nations and all that imperialist bullshit. And that's the response of Ukrainians. Okay, where is the response of Ukrainians? I'm afraid the button is not working very well. Okay, finally we see it. Oh, sorry. Okay, worked. Let me go back one. Oh no, sorry. You just wanted to fast forward me. I know 5 minutes are remaining, so I need to. Okay, very quickly how the Ukrainians responded. And in this way, humor also helped not only to expose this absurdity, of Russian imperialist ideology, but to tell the real history of Ukraine and to highlight for international audiences who might not be familiar with that actually Kyiv was created centuries before Moscow, and that the democratic tradition that existed in Kyiv Rus is something that preceded Ukrainian democracy now. So telling the real story of Ukraine, the real history of Ukraine, is something that humor is also helpful with. Technology is failing me. And of course, memes and humor were helpful to remind global audiences what Russia really is. And obviously, Russia is acting as a terrorist state in Ukraine. And just using references to memes from Western popular culture was helpful to highlight that. And what Russia's real goals in Ukraine are, again, that Russian aggression is essentially an imperialist conquest. Russia's aim is not just to grab some part of Ukrainian territory or stop Ukraine's accession into NATO. It's to deprive Ukraine of its sovereignty, is to destroy Ukraine's independence, and just basically transform Ukraine in another puppet state, completely dependent on Moscow. Humor is also helpful in, dismantling the appeal of the great Russian culture that so many people in other countries, even the supporters of Ukraine, are still under an influence for. So they kind of say, well, but Russian culture is one thing and Russian aggression against Ukraine is another thing. But no, they are not. They are part of the same imperialist ideology. And Ukrainians use humor, to highlight that, how Russia weaponizes culture as an instrument of imperialism. And it's also important, to kind of, humor is used to fend off all the whataboutism and hyper-focus in many countries, especially in the global south, on American imperialism or on Western imperialism. Of course, there is a legacy of Western imperialism in many countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And Russia exploits that because they try to portray their fight in Ukraine and their aggression against Ukraine as a fight against Western imperialism, while they are themselves conducting an imperialist war in Ukraine. So Ukrainians, again, are using humor and memes to describe Russian aggression for what it is, that it is an imperialist aggression, that it is no different and no better than any form of Western imperialism that Russia is claiming to be fighting with. And ultimately, last but not least, humor is about giving hope. Not just to Ukrainians, but to people all over the world, that imperialism can be defeated, that aggressive actions by states that feel that they are completely deprived of any accountability, that they can behave with impunity, violating international law, committing war crimes, that this is going to end. And Ukraine is not alone, luckily, in that fight. We have, our partners and allies from Baltic states, from Central Europe, from other countries who have similar experience of Russian imperialism, of Russian colonialism, who are helping us to tell our story. And one day, of course, we will rave on Putin's grave. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, there were some interesting hours, and this morning I spent 5 hours answering questions of Ukrainian border service and trying to prove that I'm not an agent of Lukashenko. But I think my life proved that I am the main enemy of Putinism and Lukashism, and I will do it all my life. First of all, I'd like to give a big round of applause to Ukrainian journalists who are inspiration to all of us and who are driving forces of Ukraine's fight for freedom alongside with Ukraine armed forces. And I have to say that Ukraine's fight for freedom is deeply interconnected with Belarusian fight for freedom. And it did not start only in 2022. It started a long time ago because Belarusians were inspired by Ukraine's fight for freedom against the Soviet Union, then the Revolution of Dignity 2014, and that was the spark for Belarusian national identity rise, when Belarusians saw how Ukrainians are defending their culture, their history, wearing vyshyvanka, and suddenly all Belarusians started to wear vyshyvanka. We made vyshymaika, like a t-shirt, embroidered t-shirts, and even Lukashenko had to follow the trend at some point, and he was driving the tractor wearing vyshyvanka, trying to be loved by the people, but it didn't help him much. People still hated him, hate him now, and will hate him to the end of his life. Belarus' fight for freedom is difficult, but also similar to what Ukrainians, to what Armenians, Georgians, and Moldovans are passing right now. Belarus was in very unlucky circumstances. In contrast to Ukraine, Belarus was much longer, an entire territory, entire population under Russian dominance since 18th century. We didn't have chance to revive or build our national identity. When Russians came, they immediately destroyed everything, starting from beginning of 19th century, that made us Europeans. And now, under Lukashenko, who is serving to Putin, it just continues the same process. Just imagine, 100 years ago, 90% of Belarusians spoke Belarusian language. Right now, it's only 10%. Of course, situation is changing, and it's changing not because of Lukashenko, but primarily because of people, young people who are traveling, and because of technology. Basically, technologies, Facebook, Instagram, and even TikTok, they helped us in 2010, 2015, to shape, to cultivate, to nourish the culture of Belarus again. And many people, they rediscovered they're not Russians, they belong to Europe. There was Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there was the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, we were part of something big, we were part of Europe, and only because of technologies, Belarusian language had another chance. And in 2020, it was a peak of this new wave of national revival. You all remember huge protests of Belarusians. 1.5 million Belarusians participated in this protest all over the country. It was not because of economy. It was not because of strong political alternative. It was really inspired by willingness of people to live in Europe, though people didn't understand yet what exactly the path to Europe is. But Ukrainians right now are showing that this path is difficult, and many and more Belarusians understand that a big path is still ahead of us to this European future we all dream about. Belarusians, during these 2 centuries of Russian colonialism, basically forgot many things that are just now reviving and growing from inside. You know this movie, TV show, Silo, Bunker, which was popular like last year ago, when there is a whole nation living underground for so long that these people already forgot why they are living underground. And those who are in management, they can't explain it either, but they just can't go outside to the open world because, there is such tradition. And when generations are changing, a new generation are coming, but they still keep this tradition, we are underground and we have to live underground. Something similar happens to Belarusians, basically isolated politically, informationally, culturally from the open and the free world. They started to forget. Technology opened this path. Lukashenko was interested, dictator Lukashenko, who is in power for 30 years, for those who came from Australia and other parts of the world, he basically was interested to keep the nation in this silo, so people don't ask questions why we live in underground. They just don't ask these questions. If you ask questions, you're punished. And this reminds me of another movie. Perhaps you watched it, Goodbye Lenin. Did you watch it, anyone? So Goodbye Lenin, it's about creating the parallel reality. So the regime understood that in order to make people not asking questions, who are they, where they belong, what is their history, what is the real culture, they basically, with the help of technologies, propaganda, media of course, they create this Goodbye Lenin reality. And this is repeated so many times, starting from the kindergarten, in schools, introducing the new lectures. In my school and the university, we had state ideology, we had history of the great patriotic war, Second World War, and all of these lectures were the core of educational process, where we are basically taught that, you are part of this big Russia, you are part of this big Soviet narrative. Everything else, it's not up to your mind. Don't ask questions. It's punishable. And this Goodbye Lenin approach, it was dominating and it was working, it was efficient until 2010s, again, when technologies came. And this power of technology is still relevant right now, when Belarus, after 2020 crackdown, when revolution did not succeed, it was not finished, Lukashenko completely destroyed alternative media. There are no access for ordinary people to television, to radio, but internet basically allowing them to breathe the fresh air. And this gives me hope that despite of these repressions, the terror, this huge propaganda, massive propaganda, people still finding the way to get inspired, to get energized, and they do some activities. And now the space of this fighting, Russianism, Russian toxic ideology, and Lukashism, basically, primarily, it's happening in the informational space. For Belarusian journalists, it's a huge challenge. When you don't have access to the sources of information, when you can't be on the ground, how to cover the events. And there was some challenge to reorganize the media organizations, the outlets who were forced to go into exile for this new reality. And many of them, they basically empowered the population, the ordinary people. All those who were just subscribers, followers on YouTube, on Instagram, they became the journalists. In normal life, we call them citizen journalists, but we call them our underground intelligence. And this underground intelligence basically deliver media with news, with insights, And this leaking information about life inside, it becomes the national sports right now. And from one hand, we have this repressive apparatus, Lukashenko, who is attacking the West, blackmailing with nuclear weapons. We will prevail over Ukrainians, we will march Hromadske, we will kill all Poles. And on the other hand, there are thousands of contacts and people inside the system, working for the system, even for KGB and the police, who are leaking information to the journalists, to independent media, to democratic forces about the real situation from inside. This also gives me hope. Regarding the situation with identity, we see how the regime is trying to split society on two parts. Basically, right now, we are in the situation when there are two Belarus. One Belarus is occupied, and it's de facto true. Yes, formally, it's still an independent country. It reminds us Vichy's France during the Second World War, when France was formally independent country, but serving the metropole. Similar situation with Lukashenko's Belarus. And this Belarus is quickly, intensively Russified on all stages, in educational, information, and cultural space. But there is another Belarus which exists virtually in information space and which exists in exile. And this is Belarus, which is basically the one we can influence the most. Their goal not just to abolish the regime, which is inside the country, inside Belarus, but also to preserve culture and identity. And we see right now how all these thousands of initiatives that were existing inside the country, promoting Belarusian language, culture, identity, they now in Poland, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Lithuania, they are creating schools, launching Belarus language courses, trying to save Belarusian traditions, national holidays, everything that is impossible inside the country. And our goal in the future, when the situation changes, and it definitely will change, will be to reconcile these two Belarus. Because Belarusians in general are very different from Russians. In case of the war, we can see it even in surveys. In Russia, we see this Z signs, V signs, this toxic, indoctrinated society with propaganda. In Belarus, you cannot see this, but you cannot also see the resistance. But when we take the surveys, we see, and people are asked, do you want Belarusian army to participate in the war, or Belarusian troops must join Russian troops? Only 4 or 5% say yes. When people are asked, do you want unification with Russia? Only 5% answer yes. And Lukashenko, dictator of Belarus, and Putin, they also understand it. So they are interested in having in Belarus kind of buffer zone, which is basically passively supporting the war, helping Russia in terms of ammunition, in terms of weapons, providing the territory for shelling and attacking Ukraine. But on the other hand, they are not trying to touch this in-depth Belarusianness, Europeanness of the society. Speaking about the solutions, right now we are trying, as democratic forces of Belarus, we are trying to work inside the country, but only in underground. I work with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was an accidental president, leader who didn't want to be the politician. She hates to be a politician. She hates to be a political leader, which on one hand, of course, doesn't make her a very charismatic leader who can inspire the revolution. But on the other hand, she represents very strong contrast to masculine, dictatorial, tyrant Lukashenko. And our goal right now is to present to Belarusians inside the country the alternative, what their life could be, to create for them the right incentive to fight. Because when you live in full isolation, in the terror, in the atmosphere of terror of like in Stalin times, what you want to see, you want to get energized and you want to understand what you are suffering for. So our goal, primary, first, right now is to show Belarusians positive alternative. This is why we are trying to work with the European countries, with the Brussels, with Washington, and to show that what benefits Belarus can get if it becomes independent and free of Russian claws. And very important, what Ukraine shows, the success, the inspiration, the unity in countering Russian propaganda and Russian aggression. And second, what Moldova is achieving. Because Moldova actually, which is not neighboring country for us, but neighboring for Ukraine, but which was also part of the Soviet Union, that they made a huge progress. Second goal of ours is to inspire the resistance movement inside the country. And here, as I said, we have the underground activities. Many of them are connected to sabotage groups who stop the Russian railways. But the most interesting sabotage activities are in cyberspace again, conducted by Belarusian cyber partisans. And just 2 weeks ago, there was a very important action of cyber partisans which showed the vulnerability of the regime. They hacked the database of Belarusian KGB. And they leaked the database of all letters sent to KGB during 9 years. KGB, which is presented as a super powerful organization controlling everything, basically appeared to be not able to defend its own database, and all the names of all KGB informants, they were leaked outside. And the third goal of us is to strengthen national identity, because national identity, again, is the strongest antidote to Russian world. And I shouldn't convince Ukrainians, you know very well how national identity is important, how language is important. But what we have to do, we have to deliver this understanding to people inside the country. And right now, without strong media, without self-organized society, it's very difficult. But seeing creativity of our citizen journalists, of our people's intelligence, of our cyber partisans, I am sure that this will be possible. Thank you again for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions later in the coffee room. Thank you.